The early morning of May 10, 1940, found General Lieutenant Heinz Guderian, positioned with his 19th Panzer Corps near the Luxembourg border, poised to execute an operation that would revolutionize modern warfare and shatter the illusion of French military supremacy. The invasion plan that would unfold over the next 6 weeks would become the defining example of blitzkrieg warfare, demonstrating how armored forces employed with operational audacity could defeat numerically superior armies with devastating speed. Guderian, the architect and evangelist of German panzer doctrine, was about to prove his theories in the most spectacular fashion possible. The conventional wisdom among military professionals in 1940 held that any German invasion of France would follow the pattern of 1914, with modifications to account for modern weapons, but fundamentally similar in scope and duration. The French High Command expected a German attack through Belgium, possibly extending into the Netherlands. They had positioned their best forces to meet this attack, confident that the Maginot Line protected the Franco-German border and that the Ardennes Forest was impassable to armored forces. The plan was to meet the German invasion in Belgium, establish defensive lines, and fight a prolonged campaign that would favor France's larger population and greater industrial capacity. Guderian's operational concept was fundamentally different from anything the French anticipated. Rather than dispersing armor to support infantry, as French doctrine dictated, Guderian concentrated his panzer divisions into powerful armored fists capable of independent operations. Rather than advancing cautiously to maintain contact with flanking units, he intended to drive forward at maximum speed, bypassing resistance and striking deep into enemy rear areas. Rather than waiting for infantry to consolidate gains, he planned to maintain momentum regardless of what was happening behind him. This approach contradicted traditional military wisdom and made many German generals deeply uncomfortable. The plan called for German armor to cross the Meuse River at Sedan, then drive west toward the English Channel, cutting off the Allied armies advancing into Belgium. The concept was operationally brilliant, but terrifyingly risky. The armored spearheads would advance with exposed flanks stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Supply lines would be tenuous. If the French mounted effective counterattacks against the corridor of advance, the panzer divisions could be cut off and destroyed. Guderian had spent years developing the doctrine that would guide this operation. His book, Achtung Panzer, had outlined the theoretical basis for armored warfare as an independent operational arm rather than as support for infantry. He had studied the British theorists Fuller and Liddell Hart, absorbing their ideas about mechanized warfare and adapting them to German circumstances. He had trained his panzer divisions to operate at the tempo required for this kind of warfare, drilling them in rapid movement, quick decision-making, and aggressive exploitation of success. Yet even within the German military establishment, Guderian's ideas faced skepticism. Traditional officers viewed tanks as useful for supporting infantry attacks, but doubted they could operate independently for extended periods. The logistics of supplying fast-moving armored formations seemed prohibitive. The risks of having armor advance far ahead of supporting infantry seemed reckless. Guderian had spent years arguing against these objections, but theory was about to be tested against the most formidable military power in Europe. The invasion began with Luftwaffe strikes against Allied airfields and communication centers, establishing air superiority that would prove crucial for subsequent operations. German infantry and motorized divisions poured into Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, implementing the deception that the main German effort was repeating the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. Allied forces moved forward to meet what they assumed was the primary German attack, exactly as German planners had anticipated. While Allied attention focused on Belgium, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps moved through the Ardennes Forest. French intelligence had dismissed the Ardennes as unsuitable terrain for armored operations, but Guderian had planned meticulously for the passage. His forces moved in long columns through the winding forest roads, vulnerable to air attack but protected by German air superiority.
The advance through the Ardennes was slower than movement across open ground, but faster than the French had believed possible for armored forces in such terrain. By May 12th, Guderian's forces had reached the Meuse River near Sedan. This was the critical point of the operation. The river represented a significant obstacle, defended by French forces positioned in fortifications along the far bank. Crossing would require coordination between engineers, infantry, armor, and artillery under fire. Failure here would stall the entire operation and give the Allies time to recognize where the real German attack was coming from and shift forces to counter it. The assault crossing of the Meuse on May 13th demonstrated the integration of combined arms that made blitzkrieg effective. Luftwaffe dive bombers struck French defensive positions with devastating precision, their screaming sirens adding psychological impact to the physical destruction. German artillery laid down suppressive fire, while engineers prepared river crossing equipment. Infantry assaulted across the river in boats and rafts, establishing bridgeheads under intense fire. By late afternoon, German forces held positions on the western bank. The intensity of the Meuse assault represented a new form of warfare that combined firepower, speed, and psychological shock. The Stuka dive bombers did not simply drop explosives, they attacked in waves that created continuous pressure on French defenders. The sirens attached to the aircraft produced a distinctive wailing sound designed to terrorize those on the receiving end. French soldiers in the defensive bunkers found themselves under sustained bombardment that gave them no respite to organize effective resistance. The German artillery fire was coordinated with the airstrikes to maintain constant pressure. As the Stukas pulled away from their bombing runs, artillery shells were already impacting the same targets. This seamless transition between air and ground fire support required careful timing and communication that exemplified the integrated operations Guderian had emphasized in his training. French soldiers on the defensive bunkers who survived the air attacks found no breathing space before artillery forced them back under cover. German infantry crossing the Meuse did so under conditions that would have broken less well-trained units. The river was too deep to ford and too wide to cross quickly. Boats and rafts were vulnerable to defensive fire from French positions on the western bank. Yet the German assault troops moved forward with discipline, using smoke screens and suppressive fire to reduce French defensive effectiveness. Once across, they established foothold positions and began expanding the bridgeheads systematically. The night of May 13th to 14th was critical for the operation's success. French forces attempted to organize counterattacks to eliminate the bridgeheads before they could be reinforced. German infantry held their positions through confused night fighting, using flares and machine gun fire to break up French attacks. The defenders of the bridgehead knew that if they were pushed back across the river, the entire operation would stall and the breakthrough opportunity would be lost. The critical moment came in the early morning of May 14th, when German engineers completed a pontoon bridge capable of bearing the weight of tanks. Guderian's panzers began crossing, while French forces were still reeling from the initial assault. The speed of the bridge construction surprised French commanders, who expected more time to organize counterattacks. By the time French armored reserves moved forward to seal the bridgehead, German panzers were already debouching from it, ready to resume the advance. What followed over the next days was the operational exploitation that Guderian had theorized and trained for, but that the world had never witnessed on such a scale. The panzer divisions did not pause to consolidate the bridgehead or wait for infantry to catch up. Instead, they drove westward at speeds that shocked both friend and foe. Guderian's leading elements advanced 50 kilometers on May 15th, 60 kilometers on May 16th. French defensive positions were bypassed rather than assaulted. Communication centers and headquarters were overrun before they could coordinate responses.
The pace of advance created its own momentum. German reconnaissance units would identify French positions blocking the advance. Rather than launching immediate assaults, Guderian's forces would probe for weaknesses or gaps in the defensive line.
When a gap was found, armored forces poured through it, bypassing strong points and driving deeper into French rear areas. The bypassed positions often surrendered once they realized German forces were behind them, or they were left to be dealt with by following infantry divisions. The advancing columns operated with the sophistication that came from intensive training. Lead elements consisted of reconnaissance units that probed ahead, identifying obstacles and enemy positions. Behind them came combat engineers, ready to clear obstacles or repair bridges. The main body of tanks followed, ready to exploit any opening. Supporting them were motorized infantry who could dismount to clear resistance that tanks alone could not overcome. Artillery and anti-aircraft units moved with the columns, providing support without slowing the advance. German logistics during the advance operated on principles that conventional military wisdom considered reckless. Fuel trucks moved forward continuously, often under fire, to keep the panzers moving. Ammunition was distributed based on immediate need rather than careful calculation of future requirements. Food and other supplies were deprioritized in favor of fuel and ammunition. Maintenance was conducted on the move when possible, with seriously damaged vehicles being abandoned rather than recovered if recovery would slow the advance. The psychological impact on French forces facing this onslaught was devastating. French units established defensive positions only to discover that German armor had already bypassed them. Communication with higher headquarters was lost as German forces overran command posts. Orders arrived for movements to positions that were already in German hands. The carefully planned French defensive scheme became irrelevant as the situation changed faster than the French command structure could process. The French military command structure proved incapable of responding to this tempo of operations. French doctrine emphasized methodical preparation and coordinated attacks at all levels. Commanders expected to have time to assess situations, consult with superiors, issue detailed orders, and wait for all units to be in position before moving. Guderian's forces were operating inside the French decision cycle, moving so fast that by the time French commanders understood where German forces were, they had already advanced to new positions. French armored forces, which were qualitatively equal or superior to German tanks individually, were dispersed throughout the French army as infantry support. When French commanders attempted to concentrate armor for counterattacks, the units could not assemble quickly enough. Roads were clogged with refugees and retreating troops. German air superiority made daylight movement dangerous. Communication systems broke down as headquarters were overrun. The carefully planned French responses became irrelevant before they could be executed. Guderian's advance created a crisis within the German high command as well as among the Allies. The speed of the advance alarmed conservative German generals who feared that the panzer divisions were exposing themselves to catastrophic counterattacks. On May 16th, when Guderian's forces had advanced over 100 kilometers from their Meuse crossing, senior German commanders ordered him to halt and wait for infantry divisions to catch up and protect his flanks. The halt order represented exactly the kind of traditional military thinking that Guderian had been fighting against for years. His entire operational concept depended on maintaining momentum, on moving so fast that the enemy could not organize effective responses. Every day spent waiting for infantry to consolidate gains was a day the Allies could use to organize defenses or counterattacks. The halt order, if obeyed, would negate the revolutionary potential of armored warfare and reduce the campaign to a more conventional grinding advance. Guderian's response to the halt order would become legendary in military history. He technically obeyed by halting his headquarters, but allowed his forward elements to continue advancing, characterizing their movement as reconnaissance in force rather than as offensive operations. This creative interpretation of orders allowed the advance to continue while providing Guderian with nominal compliance with his superiors' directives. The maneuver demonstrated both his operational audacity and his willingness to bend rules when he believed the tactical situation required it. The halt lasted only 24 hours before Guderian received permission to resume full-scale advance, but those 24 hours revealed the tension between traditional military caution and the new tempo of armored warfare. Conservative generals saw exposed flanks and vulnerable supply lines. Guderian saw an enemy in confusion, incapable of organizing the counterattacks that worried his superiors. Both perspectives had validity, but events would vindicate Guderian's assessment. By May 20th, 10 days after the invasion began, Guderian's forces reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had advanced over 300 kilometers in 10 days, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium from the main French armies to the south. The maneuver had created a pocket containing the British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and Belgian forces, over 1 million Allied soldiers trapped against the coast, with German forces between them and safety. The strategic implications of this achievement were staggering. In less than 2 weeks, German forces had accomplished what 4 years of fighting in the First World War had not achieved: the decisive defeat of French military power and the isolation of British forces on the continent. The speed of the success shocked not just the Allies, but much of the German high command, who had expected a longer, more conventional campaign. The comparison to World War I was inescapable and deeply significant. The Western Front of 1914 to 1918 had consumed millions of lives in attritional warfare, where gains were measured in meters and victories in kilometers. Massive offensives like Verdun and the Somme had achieved tactical gains at horrific cost without producing strategic decisions. The trench stalemate had come to define modern warfare in the minds of military professionals worldwide. Guderian's breakthrough shattered this paradigm completely. Where World War I had shown that modern defensive firepower could stop any offensive, Guderian demonstrated that properly employed armored forces could achieve breakthrough and exploitation despite defensive advantages. Where World War I had taught that territorial gains required massive material expenditure and lengthy preparation, Guderian showed that speed and concentration could achieve more with less. The psychological impact of this reversal was as significant as the operational achievement. French military planning had been shaped fundamentally by World War I experience. The Maginot Line represented France's determination never again to fight the attritional warfare that had bled the nation white between 1914 and 1918. French doctrine emphasized the primacy of firepower and the importance of methodical, coordinated operations. The entire French military establishment was oriented towards fighting a war that resembled the previous conflict, but with better fortifications and more firepower.
This preparation for the last war rather than the next one was not unique to France. Most military establishments suffer from similar conservatism, but the consequences were particularly severe because Guderian's methods represented such a radical departure from World War I patterns. French forces were prepared to fight a slow, methodical campaign of position warfare. They faced instead a war of rapid movement, where speed mattered more than firepower, and where operational audacity trumped methodical preparation. The British forces trapped in the pocket faced similar conceptual challenges. The British Expeditionary Force was well trained and adequately equipped, but it operated according to doctrine that assumed time for deliberate planning and coordinated operations. The tempo of German operations disrupted these assumptions. British units often received orders to move to positions that were already untenable, or to conduct operations for which the necessary preparations were impossible given the time available. The operational achievement demonstrated several revolutionary aspects of armored warfare. First, the concentration of armor in independent divisions, rather than dispersing it as infantry support, created striking power capable of achieving breakthrough and exploitation. Second, the emphasis on speed and continuous movement prevented enemies from establishing defensive lines.
Third, the integration of air power, armor, and motorized infantry created a combined arms capability far more potent than any single arm operating alone. The success also revealed vulnerabilities in Allied military doctrine and command structures. French emphasis on methodical preparation and coordinated operations at all levels made them incapable of responding to the tempo of German operations. British forces, though individually well-trained and equipped, were tied to French command structures that could not adapt quickly enough. Belgian and Dutch forces were overwhelmed before they could establish effective defensive positions. The psychological impact of the breakthrough was as significant as the operational achievement. French military leadership had entered the campaign confident in their superiority. France possessed more tanks than Germany, often of superior quality. The French army was large, well-trained, and equipped with modern weapons. The Maginot Line represented the latest in military engineering. Yet within 2 weeks, French forces were in disarray, their command structure broken, their strategic position hopeless. The pace of the German advance created panic among civilian populations as well as military forces. Millions of French, Belgian, and Dutch civilians fled before the German advance, clogging roads and making military movement more difficult. The refugee flows contributed to the breakdown of Allied command and control, as headquarters lost contact with subordinate units and commanders struggled to determine what was happening. German forces exploited the chaos, with forward elements often advancing through columns of refugees and retreating soldiers who did not realize German forces were already so far west. Guderian's operational methods during the breakthrough became a template for armored warfare that would be studied and emulated for decades. He operated from forward positions, often at or near the front lines of his advancing forces. This allowed him to make rapid decisions based on actual battlefield conditions, rather than waiting for reports to filter back through headquarters. He delegated authority to subordinate commanders, giving them clear objectives but freedom to determine how to achieve them. He maintained communication with his divisions through radio, a technology that enabled the rapid coordination necessary for mobile warfare. The emphasis on forward command and rapid decision-making created risks. Guderian repeatedly found himself in danger, with his command vehicles sometimes coming under fire from French forces. Communication with higher headquarters was sometimes sporadic, creating situations where senior German commanders were uncertain of his exact location or situation. But these risks were offset by the operational advantages of rapid decision-making and personal assessment of battlefield conditions. The logistics of supporting the advance presented challenges that would have stopped conventional operations. Guderian's panzers consumed fuel at rates that strained German supply systems. Ammunition expenditure exceeded planned levels. Mechanical breakdowns removed tanks from service faster than field maintenance could repair them. Yet the advance continued because Guderian prioritized maintaining momentum over maintaining perfect logistics support. Units continued forward on partial fuel loads. Broken-down vehicles were bypassed and left for recovery units. Ammunition was redistributed from units in reserve to units in contact. This approach to logistics horrified traditional German staff officers who had been trained to ensure units were properly supplied before beginning operations. But Guderian understood that in mobile warfare, maintaining tempo was more important than maintaining perfect logistics. The French were not defeated because German logistics were superior. They were defeated because German forces moved faster than French forces could react, and that speed depended on prioritizing momentum over administrative perfection. The human cost of the breakthrough was significant but asymmetric. German casualties in the first 2 weeks of the campaign were substantial, with thousands killed and wounded in the Maze crossing and subsequent fighting. But Allied casualties were far higher, and more importantly, the operational situation created by Guderian's advance would lead to the capture of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers as the pocket in Belgium was compressed. The success of the breakthrough also created strategic choices that would shape the remainder of the campaign. German forces now had the option of turning north to destroy the trapped Allied armies in Belgium, or turning south to complete the defeat of French forces. Hitler and the German High Command chose to pause the drive north and allow infantry forces to compress the Dunkirk pocket, a decision that would allow over 300,000 British and French soldiers to evacuate across the English Channel. Guderian's frustration with the halt before Dunkirk was evident, but not publicly expressed. He recognized that the trapped Allied forces represented a massive strategic opportunity, and every day they were allowed to organize defenses or evacuate was a day that reduced the completeness of German victory. But the decision was made at levels above his authority, and his role shifted to preparing for the next phase of operations against remaining French forces south of the breakthrough corridor. The second phase of the French campaign, Fall Rot or Case Red, began on June 5th, with German forces attacking southward from the Somme. Guderian now commanded a panzer group, an enlarged formation controlling multiple panzer corps. The operational concept remained rapid breakthrough followed by deep exploitation, but the French were now more prepared and the German forces more experienced. The balance between these factors would determine whether the lightning success of May could be repeated.
The advance south demonstrated that the initial breakthrough had not been simply the result of French unpreparedness or strategic surprise. French forces in the second phase were better positioned, more alert to the threat of armored breakthroughs, and had attempted to adapt their tactics. Yet Guderian's forces again achieved rapid penetration and exploitation. French defensive lines that should have held for weeks were pierced in days. French armored counterattacks were defeated or bypassed. The fundamental superiority of German operational methods proved consistent across different tactical circumstances. By mid-June, Guderian's forces were driving into the French interior with the same speed that had characterized the May breakthrough. French resistance continued, but was increasingly disorganized and local rather than coordinated and strategic. The French government fled Paris, which was declared an open city. French military leadership recognized that the campaign was lost and began considering armistice rather than continued resistance. The operational achievement of the French campaign was unprecedented in modern warfare. In 6 weeks, German forces had defeated what was considered the strongest military power in Europe. France, which had fought Germany to exhaustion over 4 years in the First World War, had been completely defeated in less than 2 months. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from the continent, leaving Britain isolated and vulnerable. The strategic situation in Europe had been transformed in a time frame that seemed impossible according to conventional military wisdom. Guderian's role in this achievement was central and decisive. His operational concepts had provided the framework for the campaign. His leadership during the breakthrough had demonstrated the viability of independent armored operations. His willingness to push forward despite risks and to creatively interpret restrictive orders had maintained momentum at critical moments. The success vindicated years of theoretical argument and doctrinal development against conservative military opinion. The victory also had implications beyond the immediate military situation. It established blitzkrieg as the dominant operational concept for the early years of the war, influencing planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union and shaping German strategic thinking. It demonstrated vulnerabilities in Allied military thinking that would require years to overcome. It created confidence in German military capabilities that would persist even when circumstances had changed and the operational methods that worked in France became less effective in other theaters. The analysis of how Guderian achieved such rapid success became a focus of military study in all armies. The integration of armor, air power, and motorized infantry into a coordinated combined arms force was recognized as crucial.
The emphasis on speed and continuous advance, rather than consolidation, was understood as creating operational tempo that enemies could not match. The concentration of armor into powerful formations, rather than dispersing it, was identified as creating decisive striking power. But the analysis also revealed factors specific to the French campaign that might not be replicable in other circumstances. The French command structure had been particularly rigid and slow to adapt. The terrain in France was generally favorable to armored movement. German air superiority was more complete than it would be in later campaigns. The strategic surprise achieved by attacking through the Ardennes gave German forces crucial advantages in the initial phase. Replicating the success would require similar favorable conditions or significant adaptation of methods. Guderian himself was aware that the French campaign represented optimal conditions for the operational concepts he had developed. He recognized that the speed of the breakthrough had depended on specific factors: surprise, air superiority, enemy unpreparedness, that might not exist in future campaigns. His subsequent writings and operational planning showed awareness that blitzkrieg methods would need to be adapted to different circumstances rather than mechanically repeated. The limitations of the operational method would become apparent in later campaigns. In the Soviet Union, the vast distances and harsh conditions would strain the logistics that had barely sustained operations in France. In North Africa, the limited infrastructure and extended supply lines would constrain the kind of rapid exploitation that had worked in France. Against increasingly prepared and adaptive Allied forces, the element of surprise that had contributed to the French breakthrough would be difficult to achieve. Yet in May and June of 1940, these limitations were not yet apparent. What was visible was the most spectacular military success in modern history, achieved through operational concepts that Guderian had championed for years against skepticism and resistance. The breakthrough demonstrated that armor employed with audacity could achieve results that traditional military thinking considered impossible. The 6 weeks that shattered French military power validated Guderian's theories and established principles of armored warfare that would influence military doctrine for generations. The human dimension of the achievement was significant. Guderian had committed his reputation and career to the theories being tested in France. If the breakthrough had failed, if French counterattacks had cut off his exposed columns, if the advance had bogged down into attritional warfare, he would have been blamed for reckless tactics and discredited theories. The success instead made him one of the most celebrated commanders in the German military and established his historical reputation as a pioneer of armored warfare. The impact on his soldiers was equally important. The panzer crews who had executed the breakthrough gained confidence in their equipment, their tactics, and their leadership. They had defeated enemies they had been taught to respect, overcome obstacles they had been warned were impossible, and achieved objectives that had seemed impossibly ambitious. This confidence would sustain them through harder campaigns ahead, though it would also contribute to overconfidence when conditions were less favorable. For the French soldiers who had been defeated, the experience was devastating. They had believed in French military superiority and had been trained in doctrine that emphasized methodical preparation and coordinated operations. The speed of their defeat, the inability of their leadership to respond effectively, and the collapse of the military and political structures they had trusted created a psychological trauma that went beyond the immediate military disaster. The strategic consequences of Guderian's breakthrough extended far beyond France. Britain was left isolated, facing a Germany that controlled the European continent. The Soviet Union, which had watched the French campaign with alarm, accelerated its own military preparations while maintaining the non-aggression pact with Germany. The United States, still neutral, began to reconsider its security situation in light of the rapid German victory. The entire strategic architecture of Europe had been transformed in a time frame that seemed impossible according to conventional military wisdom. Guderian's role in this achievement was central and decisive. His operational concepts had provided the framework for the campaign. His leadership during the breakthrough had demonstrated the viability of independent armored operations. His willingness to push forward despite risks and to creatively interpret restrictive orders had maintained momentum at critical moments. The success vindicated years of theoretical argument and doctrinal development against conservative military opinion. The victory also had implications beyond the immediate military situation. It established blitzkrieg as the dominant operational concept for the early years of the war, influencing planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union and shaping German strategic thinking. It demonstrated vulnerabilities in Allied military thinking that would require years to overcome. It created confidence in German military capabilities that would persist even when circumstances had changed and the operational methods that worked in France became less effective in other theaters. The analysis of how Guderian achieved such rapid success became a focus of military study in all armies. The integration of armor, air power, and motorized infantry into a coordinated combined arms force was recognized as crucial. The emphasis on speed and continuous advance rather than consolidation was understood as creating operational tempo that enemies could not match. The concentration of armor into powerful formations rather than dispersing it was identified as creating decisive striking power. But the analysis also revealed factors specific to the French campaign that might not be replicable in other circumstances. The French command structure had been particularly rigid and slow to adapt. The terrain in France was generally favorable to armored movement. German air superiority was more complete than it would be in later campaigns. The strategic surprise achieved by attacking through the Ardennes gave German forces crucial advantages in the initial phase. Replicating the success would require similar